we've got to first look back, way back, to a time when the world was still young, untamed, and so full of magic. This was the age of heroes. And it's where a lot of the big names and stories we hear about in Westeros got their start. It all kicked off when the first men showed up. Thousands of years ago, somewhere between 10 to 12,000, depending on who you ask. They crossed over from the continent of Essos into Westeros using a land bridge called the Arm of Dawn. Now these weren't delicate settlers. They were tough, stubborn, and brought over bronze weapons, horses, and a serious sense of ownership wherever they went. But when the first men arrived, Westeros wasn't empty. The land was already home to the children of the forest, who were a mysterious race that had been living there for thousands of years, before any human ever set foot on the continent. In A Clash of Kings, Maester Luwin describes them like this. They were a people of the dawn, small of stature, but great of heart, with eyes like pools of shadow, and hair the color of autumn leaves. The children of the forest didn't make castles or cities. They lived in harmony with the woods, blending into the trees or settling in caves and hidden forest villages as clans. They used obsidian, also known as dragon glass, for their weapons. And they carved faces into the weirwood trees, believing those trees connected them to their gods. Based on that description, it might be easy to think they were just a passive, childlike race. But that wasn't the case at all. Actually, they were very powerful. They had magic, real magic. They could communicate with animals, see visions through their green seers who had the gift of green sight, and tap into something ancient and unexplainable in the world. So when the first men started cutting down their sacred weirwood trees and carving up the land, the children fought back with everything they had. They used magic, obsidian, and their knowledge of the area, while the first men countered with sheer stubbornness and brutality. Eventually, after centuries of fighting, both sides realized this war was getting them nowhere. So they struck a deal called the Pact. It happened on the Isle of Faces, right in the middle of the God's Eye Lake. The first men promised to stop cutting down weirwoods and to respect the forests, while the children agreed to let the humans keep the lands they'd already taken. It was the start of a new way of life. The first men took on the children's faith, worshipping the old gods, and adopted the weirwood trees as their new sacred symbols. To this day, families like the Starks of Winterfell still follow those old traditions. Loads of heroes got their start during this time, like Bran the Builder, and the heads of various houses which we know about today had established their lineage and kingdoms back then, all over Westeros. For a while, things seemed good. The first men and the children kept their peace. The old gods were worshipped, and humanity built strongholds and traditions that would stand for thousands of years. But in the deep, frozen north, something was changing. The way old Nan tells it in A Game of Thrones. She says, "A shadow came over the world. Men froze, and women screamed, and children wept. And the others came riding on pale dead horses. and the dead walked behind them. This was the period of time known as the Long Night, and it's one of the oldest stories in the world of a song of ice and fire. It's pretty hard to tell where history ends and myth begins, especially when different regions and cultures had different versions of this legend, which we'll get into soon. But everyone agrees on at least this one thing. It was the darkest time humanity has ever faced. Across the world, from the frozen north of Westeros to the shadowed cities of Essos, people still tell tales of that endless winter that lasted a generation. Long enough for children to be born, grow old, and die without ever seeing the sun. The others, or White Walkers in the common tongue, were tall and pale creatures that came from the land of always winter, which is way, way to the north of Westeros. Even though Old Nan describes them as cold, dead things, George R.R. Martin said they aren't actually dead. They're just a different form of life. They're supposed to be strange and beautiful, inhuman and elegant, but dangerous. The way they move is unnatural, since they glide across snow without leaving footprints. Wherever they showed up, an intense cold followed, and white mists would form around them. Now some stories say the cold arrives with them, while others suggest they only come when the world is already frozen. There's no definite answer yet, which is the case with lots of things that the Maestros debate and study. The others had weapons unlike anything wielded by the men of Westeros. Their swords were thin, crystalline, and impossibly sharp, able to slice through metal armor and chainmail with basically no effort. When their blades clashed with steel, it sounded like a sharp, high-pitched wail, like a wounded animal crying out. Fire reacts strangely to these weapons as well, producing a screech when it comes into contact with them. According to George R.R. Martin, the swords are made of ice, but not our regular ice. They can do things with it that are beyond human understanding. Besides their weapons, the others could raise the dead. Corpses, animated by their magic, became whites, empty husks that did their bidding. Burning the dead was the only guaranteed way to prevent a corpse from being reanimated. Whites weren't limited to humans. They could raise a bunch of creatures, like horses, bears, direwolves, and mammoths. In some stories, the others rode on giant ice spiders. The wildlings believed that the others could smell the warmth of life, and that they hated every creature with hot blood in its veins. In some really messed up stories, the wildlings would kidnap women from throughout the Seven Kingdoms to the south and give them over to the others, and they would bear half-human children during the long night. Later on, some would get really desperate and start treating the others like gods. A really awful wildling called Craster would sacrifice his sons, leaving them out as offerings for the others, as a way to make sure he's protected from them and their whites. But the Red Priestess Melisandre thinks that the White Walkers are the cold children of the Great Other, an evil god of darkness fighting a war against R'hllor, the Lord of Light. With everything you've just learned about them, it makes sense that the White Walkers were able to so easily terrorize the first men of the North It seemed like they were just absolutely unstoppable. At least until the last hero came along. His name has been lost to time, but the stories say he set out in search of the children of the forest, hoping their ancient magic and weapons could help them out. He started traveling with some companions, and he even had a horse and a dog. But the cold and the others claimed them all. One by one, his sword froze and broke. His horse died, and eventually he was left on his own. He was chased through the snow by giant ice spiders and other icy terrors. But against all odds, he actually did find the children of the forest and managed to get them to join the fight. With their dragon glass and old knowledge, humanity finally had the tools to fight back. The last stand against the others became known as the Battle for the Dawn. The remaining first men and the children of the forest managed to push back the others, and they retreated to the far north, back to the lands of always winter. The humans knew this wasn't a total victory. They just delayed the threat, not wiped it out. So in the aftermath, the survivors built the wall. Tyrion Lannister says the wall is 100 leagues long and 700 feet high. A marvel, they call it. A wonder of the world. But the real wonder is what lies beyond. It's a literal, physical barrier against the return of the others. But the children of the forest also used magic to fortify it as well. So it's more than just ice, stone, and earth. To guard this structure, the Night's Watch was created. An ancient, sworn brotherhood that swore oaths to stand vigil on the wall and defend the realms of men from the threats beyond. But all of this is Westerosi legend and history. This version of the Long Night and the Last Hero is all stuff that came from the north. Over in the east, in the continent of Essos, there's a similar but distinctly different version of events that's tied to its own myths and heroes. So let's talk about the ancient empire of Yi Ti. Across the narrow sea, beyond even the Shadowed Lands and the Bones Mountain Range, was a massive golden empire. In terms of cultural inspiration, it's sort of like a fantasy imperial China. Huge palaces, dragon motifs, and thousands of years of rich history. At its height, the empire was ruled by god-emperors who claimed descent from celestial beings, and its wealth and power were unmatched. By the time of A Song of Ice and Fire, the empire is still significant, but it's really a shadow of its former self. Its golden age had long since passed, and its history is basically myth and half-remembered stories. VT remembers the Long Night as a time when the sky went dark for a generation, and the sun vanished behind thick clouds of ash and smoke. Demons and monsters walked the earth during this time. In Yi Ti's version of the story, predictably, there's also a hero. There's actually very little info on this one, though, and the only snippet referencing this version specifically was a legend claiming that disaster during the Long Night was only averted by the deeds of a woman with a monkey's tail. But what makes Yi Ti's version of the Long Night special is the connection to an even earlier event, the fall of the great empire of the Dawn. The emperors during that time were supposedly descended from the Lion of Night and the Maiden, Maid of Light. These two deities symbolized night and day, shadow and light, and their children ruled the world in an age of peace and abundance. But with each successive ruler, their reign was shorter and more troubled, as mankind got more greedy and corrupt with each generation. The final ruler of this empire was the Amethyst Empress, who was unrightfully usurped by her younger brother, the Bloodstone Emperor. He's said to have been a cruel and tyrannical ruler who practiced dark magic and necromancy, among other forbidden arts. He denounced the true gods and instead worshipped a black stone that fell from the sky. And so, the Bloodstone Emperor's actions offended the gods. And as punishment, the Long Night descended upon the world. This version of events poses a pretty interesting question. Was the Long Night sent as a consequence of mankind's actions? Or was it just a cosmic disaster? But before we get too philosophical, there's one more version worth talking about. There's a city called Asshai, located at the edge of the known world, deep in the Shadowlands. The city is built from black stone, maybe even the same kind of black stone that the Blood Emperor worshipped. Even though it's a really huge city, Asshai is almost empty. There's no kids, no animals, and no kind of decent folk. Even the river flowing through the city, the Ash River, glows with a black, toxic light. The city is a hub for sorcerers, shadowbinders, and red priests, where they can practice horrible magic and conduct sick rituals freely. Many secrets about the world's ancient history, including the dragons, are said to be buried in its libraries. The people of Asshai have their own story about the Long Night. It centers around Azor Ahai, who is Surprise, another legendary hero who fought against the darkness. After a deep sacrifice, according to legend, he needed to forge a powerful sword, Lightbringer, to defeat the darkness. He tried to make it 3 times. On the first attempt, he tempered the blade in water, but it shattered. On the second attempt, he tempered it by driving it into the heart of a lion, but it broke again. On the third attempt, after working on it for 100 days and nights, it was time to temper the sword. So he called his beloved wife, Nissa, and asked her to bear the final sacrifice. She agreed, and Azor Ahai drove the sword into her chest. Her soul, her life, and her love were said to have poured into the steel, and the sword blazed with light. This final try created Lightbringer, the sword that would drive back the shadows. Melisandre in A Clash of Kings says, "There will come a day after a long summer when the stars bleed, and the cold breath of darkness falls heavy on the world. In this dread hour, a warrior shall draw from the fire a burning sword, and that sword shall be Lightbringer. She's one of the followers of R'hllor, the Lord of Light I mentioned earlier, who believe that Azor Ahai will return, reborn as the prince that was promised, and he'll fight against the darkness once again. Melisandre initially thinks that Stannis Baratheon is Azor Ahai, reborn. Later, her focus shifts to Jon Snow. But now, we have lots more context than we did a few years ago. And if you take into consideration the new details added in House of the Dragon recently, and the things George R.R. Martin has said, it's becoming more and more possible that Daenerys Targaryen also fits the prophecy. Just as a side note and a personal tidbit, I've always believed that she'd be the prince, or princess rather, that was promised. So I really hope this pans out if we ever get the Winds of Winter. With that being said, though, the ambiguity of the prophecy is intentional. George R.R. Martin has often said that prophecies in his world are meant to be unreliable, open to interpretation, and often misleading. So whether Azor Ahai, the last hero, and the Yi-Ti hero are all the same figure, or whether there really were 3 separate events of the Long Night that took place across the continents, is not exactly known. Let's go back to the north, in Westeros for a bit, to talk more about the Night's Watch. So like we talked about, the Night's Watch was formed to guard the wall from the threat of the White Walkers. Initially, it was a really prestigious order, and noble houses would send their younger sons to serve, seeing it as an honorable calling. But over time, as the threat of the others started to fade, the purpose of the Night's Watch and the quality of its members started to change. For most of the actual recorded history, the Watch mostly dealt with wildlings or free folk who lived north of the Wall. Even though they're obviously not inherently evil or monstrous, the wildlings are seen as lawless savages, raiders, and a threat to the supposedly civilized settled lands of the north. The men who joined the Night's Watch took lifelong vows of sacrifice, discipline, and duty. They gave up all personal ambitions, any family ties, and pretty much any chance at a normal life to serve the Watch. There's 3 roles, or jobs, when it comes to the kind of service the members do. The Rangers are the scouts and frontline fighters. They're the ones who actually cross the wall and patrol or deal with threats beyond. The Builders take care of the infrastructure of the wall and all the various forts built along its length. And then there's the Stewards, which Jon Snow starts off as. They handle the day-to-day running of the Night's Watch. Kind of like the admin side of it. They cook meals, manage supplies, and tend to the ravens who carry messages. At the head of the Night's Watch is the Lord Commander, an elected leader chosen by the brothers, who manages the alliances and limited resources of the Watch. The organization initially had 19 castles along the entirety of the Wall, but the main stronghold was called Castle Black, which was at the very center. Obviously, this would take a lot of manpower to maintain and defend. But over thousands of years, when the threats of the White Walkers didn't seem so real any, this stopped being feasible. Nobles stopped sending enough of their sons, and instead, exiles, criminals, and outcasts made up the bulk of the Night's Watchmen. And only 3 castles were manned out of the 19. Most people straight up stopped believing in the White Walkers, dismissing it as myth or superstition, or even just stories to scare kids. Before we move on from the Night's Watch, there's an interesting story I want to share. According to legend, there was an unnamed man who served as the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He's known only as the Night's King. But don't confuse that with the Night King from the show, who actually does not exist in the books, which is why I didn't really talk about him. But anyways, the Night's King lived during the Age of Heroes, not long after the wall was built, and while serving the watch, he fell in love with a woman he saw from the top of the wall. She had cold, pale white skin and eyes like bright blue stars. The Night's King chased and found her. And when he gave her his love, he gave away his soul too. He brought her back to the Nightfort, which was one of the castles along the wall. He said she was his queen, and he became a king. Using dark magic, he somehow twisted the brothers of the Night's Watch to his will, and reigned for 30 years with his so-called corpse queen. During this time, he did terrible things, like sacrifice children to the others, among atrocities that were since wiped from history. The king in the north at the time, called Brandon the Breaker, teamed up with the king beyond the wall and took down the Night's King. His name was stricken and forbidden. But when old Nan would tell this story to Bran Stark of Winterfell, she'd always say that he was a Stark. Again, though, this story is just a legend, but figured it was interesting enough to mention, and honestly, a little creepy. Speaking of creepy, though, since we're on the subject of the Nightfort, there's an old gate down there. It's called the Black Gate. In the Nightfort's kitchens, you can find a well that goes deep into the earth. There's a weirwood tree that's grown through the floor, and if you keep going down the spiral steps of the well, you'll come to the base. Weirwoods, in case you don't remember, are the trees that the children of the forest would carve faces into. The Black Gate itself is made of the glowing white weirwood. The surface has an old, withered face carved into it, with deep lines and blind, white eyes that don't seem like they've ever seen anything. When someone gets close to the gate, the eyes snap open, and the face actually speaks, asking the visitor to identify themselves. But it doesn't let just anyone through. Only someone who recites a part of the Night's Watch vow can pass. And when they do, the mouth of the face stretches wide, really wide, until it becomes this huge, gaping opening. The Black Gate is as old as the wall itself, probably built using the same kind of ancient magic that the children wove into the wall when it was being made. Let's finish off the lore dive by speaking a bit about the Starks. The Starks of Winterfell are one of the oldest noble families in Westeros, and their connection to the Long Night runs deep. In fact, their entire identity, their house words, their traditions, and even their lineage is shaped by that ancient catastrophe. Just think of their motto: "Winter is coming." While the other houses to the south have catchphrases that are meant to be bold and proud, or some kind of branding almost, the Stark's motto is a literal reminder of the return of an old threat and another long night. The founder of House Stark was Bran the Builder, who was around in the Age of Heroes. He's credited with building both Winterfell and the Wall after the Long Night ended. Now, Bran is one of those semi-mythical figures where it's hard to tell exactly how much is true and what's just legend. But the important thing is this. The Starks claim their lineage goes all the way back to the guy who built the single greatest defense against the others. And the Starks have been tied to this defense ever since. The fortress of Winterfell was built to endure harsh, endless winters. The natural hot springs under the castle keep its walls relatively warm, even in the coldest seasons. But here's where things get extra interesting. The crypts under Winterfell are massive. They stretch deep down, filled with stone statues of dead Stark lords holding iron swords across their laps. And the iron swords aren't just there for decoration. They're believed to keep the dead spirits at rest. But why would the Starks worry about that in the first place? What exactly are they trying to keep sealed in those crypts? There's theories that the crypts of Winterfell hold something significant, like maybe an ancient secret about the Long Night, or something tied to the others. And it's not hard to see why people think that. The crypts are mentioned repeatedly throughout the books, and characters describe them as cold and filled with a strange presence. The Starks are one of the few remaining houses with pure First Men blood. The majority of the southern houses have got the mixed blood of the First Men and the Andals who came later. I've got other videos that go more in depth about the Andals coming over to Westeros, but the reason this matters is because the First Men had a deep connection to the Children of the Forest and their magic. A lot of Stark children seem to inherit abilities that are tied to this magic. Warging, which is the ability to enter the minds of animals, is incredibly rare among humans. But it pops up frequently in the Stark family. Bran Stark is the most powerful example of this. But Jon Snow, Arya, and Rickon Stark also show hints of it. And then there's green seeing, where you can see through weirwood trees and even catch glimpses of the past and future. Bran Stark doesn't just become a regular greenseer. He becomes the three-eyed crow and ends up having knowledge and power that stretches back thousands of years. If you're curious about warging and green seas, check out my video about magic and sorcery in Westeros. So yeah, there's something in the Stark bloodline. Something tied to the old gods and the kind of magic that shaped the world during the Long Night. But that's where we'll end tonight's Lore Dive. Thanks for listening, and remember, winter is coming.